All the memes about it's like everybody got the racist.
Yeah.
Oh,
Seriously.
holy shit! I'm stuck in the French presidential election.
Hi, I'm Jacob Kenny.
And I'm Liam McPherson.
It's the newest edition of Hosaka Cat's favorite podcast.
It's Speech from the Throne,
episode 15.
We're here to bring you the latest and greatest from the halls of power.
But not with more banana bread posts that force you to scroll through a 70,000 word life story before getting to the freaking recipe. We're just here to argue.
Hey, Jacob, what are we talking about today?
Well, Liam, one of our competitor podcasts, the Hurly Burly, runs a podcast called The Curse of Politics. And I would like to say that politics can be a curse, but there's an even greater curse that's affecting Canadian politics as of now, and that is the curse of American attention. You see, Americans are trapped in this polarization cycle, where essentially anything the right says has to be refuted by the left, and anything the left says has to be refuted by the right. The right and left increasingly define themselves by opposition to each other, rather than holding on to any concrete ideologies. And right now, with the January 6 hearings happening in Congress, being broadcast all around the world, I fear Canada is going to be trapped in an increasingly violent polarization cycle that comes from this American left-right screaming match. And I'd like to give some examples about how Canada has already been negatively affected and just how much further we can go. So last summer, there was huge discoveries of thousands and thousands of unmarked graves in residential schools all across Canada. And this didn't just receive coverage in Canada, it received international coverage, particularly a story that was released in the summer of 2021 through the New York Times. It was the first time that Americans became aware of the fact that, Canadians are not just cuddly, cute, polite people, but actually we had done some pretty horrific things to the indigenous population. Now, the problem was the right wing in America thinks of the New York Times as an aggressively left publication. The right wing sees the New York Times as like the Fox News of the left. And so the instant that the New York Times started posting stories about all these terrible things that the Canadian state and the Catholic Church had done to indigenous people, they immediately started digging into these stories, finding faults, finding refutations, trying to sow doubt, and in some cornerstones of the American far right, they're now incubating theories about how all of this essentially was made up. They're accusing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission essentially of being a product of someone's imagination. And now that it's coming from American far-right media, it's seeping back into Canada across the border, and we're seeing far-right sources in Canada repeating this. So before, of course, there was always been racism in Canada for a long time, but there was never really this institutional backing. You wouldn't be able to source really mainstream conservative publications that would question things like, the indigenous genocide. Well, now you can. If you're a Canadian right-winger and you want to look up sources that prove what you feel to be right, that prove that these mass graves never happened, that residential schools weren't so bad, you can look it up and you can find those sources. You can do a quick Google search and you can find sources that have been shared thousands of times. And this is really disturbing stuff. It's essentially a narrative that contradicts everything we've learned about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and threatens to undermine the small amount of progress we've made in trying to rectify the terrible things that our state has done to indigenous people. And now the coverage comes to January 6th, where essentially we're seeing CNN, we're seeing, again, the New York Times, we're seeing CBC, all these news sources that right-wingers see as left-wing. They're covering congressional hearings where a lot of Democrats or Republicans that apparently are not loyal to Trump and therefore they're also left-wing are saying, Democracy is important. We need to defend democracy. The democracy is being threatened. Well, you know what the right-wing response is going to be. And we've seen it already on Fox News. If the left wing is saying democracy is good, the right wing has to say democracy is bad. If the left wing is saying democracy is under threat, the right wing has to say, don't worry about it. We're actually, it's totally fine. In fact, we should be giving more and more state controls of elections to local elected leaders who have no accountability behind them. And we Canadians are not immune to this message. There are lots and lots of conspiracy theorists, and we'll get to this later in the episode, who are listening to this, who are hearing right-wing sources broadcasting as loud as possible, and they're thinking, you know what, this coup idea, that's not such a bad idea after all. It almost worked in America. Maybe it can work here. So this January 6th coverage, it's not going to be the end of something, I fear. It's just the beginning of something. And we in Canada, we need to prepare against it now. This is not going to settle the beast of polarization. This is not going to settle concerns over democratic backsliding. It's the beginning of something far worse.
Gotta take a breath.
Yeah.
Take a breath, everybody. That's a lot to hear.
It is.
And it's true, but it's a lot. And, the January 6th committee has set up hearings that have recently started to look into former President Trump's role in aiding and abetting this incident. And so far, we've heard a number of crucial tidbits, including the fact that not only was he aware of what was going to happen, but he was excited. He was informed of a threat to hang Mike Pence, the vice president, and said, well, maybe they're right, implying that he should be hanged. There's all kinds of things that are coming to light. Sean Hannity, was in touch with Trump's people just before this happened. Senior Fox News people were in constant touch with the Trump administration. This is even predating January 6th, about the way that certain things should get covered. And this includes January 6th, the night before Sean Hannity and one of Trump's senior people were texting. But I think more information is going to come up about just how severe just how detailed his knowledge of the severity of the planned events was, and whether or not he's liable in a criminal way. And I suspect he will be. My confidence is shaken because he's gotten off the hook for 40 years, because he's been such a scumbag for 40 years, 50 years. Maybe he'll just slither away out of this one somehow. I really don't know. It seems like you just can't nail this guy down, but I suspect there will be more damning tidbits to come. The detail that's already come out about his knowledge of these events and his involvement or not with these events, which I suspect there's some involvement, certainly in not doing anything and certainly in being aware of what was going on and not taking any action. There's going to be a lot more to come out about should he be punished, and I think they've made the case so far quite convincingly. And you're probably wondering, Liam, why the hell are you going on about the States? This is a Canadian political podcast. Well, dear, the thing about...
Wow, we're going full misogyny. I like it. Okay. Well, dear.
Yeah, I just went full Reagan Republican on you.
Reminds me of a sweltering hot day in my boyhood.
It makes the hairs on my back stand up even saying it. The fact is, when Pierre Trudeau described living next to the States as like sleeping next to an elephant, the fact is that he couldn't have been more correct. Yep. And it continues to manifest itself as we see its cancer entering our politics. How does January 6th relate to any of this? Well, I will explain. The so-called Freedom Convoy was not quite a January 6th situation, I'll allow that, but there were many, 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 many people gathered in the Hill over those weeks that had intent of seeing the Prime Minister die a violent death. People had effigies of his guts on the front of their truck. Yep. We heard that there were plots to try to get into Parliament and confront or kill Trudeau. I mean, they were kind of half-baked. The level of planning luckily never got to the level of planning that we saw in January 6th. However, this was a very well-funded movement, in large part from American, not Canadian, far-right sources. Mm-hmm. Conservative circles are really well connected online. 4chan, 8chan, these are online communities that are used by a lot of conservative folks. Not all of the folks that use these services are conservative, but I would say they're overwhelmingly conservative. And it can often turn you conservative if you use it. It has a very, very racist, misogynistic outlook in the content and discussions that it produces. Their gathering places would be Reddit. I could list off more networks, but the point is that they have so many channels on which to connect internationally that it's very easy for US ideas to get imported, especially to their neighbors to the north. And, whether we like it or not, our discourse is worsening. I mean, I think what we're seeing is just an after effect of what has started since 2016, which is this welcoming with open arms of terrible, terrible rhetoric that is just untrue, but it's repeated so many times that people believe it. I mean, with that polling from Abacus data, I mean, it's nothing novel. Like, there's always been a subset of the population that believes in a bunch of bullshit. I think it's gotten a little bit worse online. I think it will only get worse with the effect of social media. But nobody's immune to this. Just because we're Canadian and we didn't have a January 6th doesn't mean that we're not already seeing the seeds being planted for the same kind of politics, as you were saying, Jacob, in your opening. And Trump was told by people in his inner circle, including Attorney General Bill Barr, by the way, that not only were claims of electoral fraud in the 2020 election was not substantive to change the election result. Georgia, a Republican state, verified. Other close states verified. Bill Barr verified. He said it's bullshit. He told Trump it's bullshit. And Trump got upset because it didn't fit with his narrative. He could not accept reality. We're seeing legitimate class grievances, and I do think some of the more working class conservative people have legitimate class grievances. We're seeing them evolve into a complete denial of reality, led by people like Trump, who don't want to admit when they've lost, who don't want to admit when they're wrong. And Trump's inner circle, we found out from these January 6 hearings, split into two camps. There were the liars, like Rudy Giuliani, who continued to, if you'll pardon my French audience, cover your kids' ears, jerk Trump off about this. Continued to say, oh yeah, we have a case. Himself, Sidney Powell, they're a laughing stock. They were getting laughed at. Judges that had to deal with them in these bogus court cases were like, are you serious? Like, they just couldn't believe what they were seeing with their own eyes. So his camp split between that side and the side of Bill Barr and some of his other high-up people in his administration who had enough. Bill Barr cut ties with Trump in December, far too late, and Giuliani, Sidney Powell, and some of the other people continued to jerk him off. Even Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, who also stayed around way too long. Like, I'm not calling any of these people heroes or trying to rehabilitate them, but even they stood up and said, dude, you're checked out on this one. Biden won, I'm sorry. And he just couldn't accept it. And he knew there was a wave of anger from his supporters, and so he continued to have these bizarre rallies where he would harness this anger, and then after being jerked off by Giuliani or Powell, would jerk his audience off. And that grew into, unfortunately, a large group of angry people who just, they couldn't believe the facts anymore because they had been groomed over the 4 years that he was in office, and before that, being let down by neoliberal failures. They had been groomed into believing what he said because it was in line with what they wanted, regardless of the fact that he was way out to lunch. So there are, to this day, tens of millions of Americans. There were some 74, 75 that voted for a million Americans, so swallow that. But among them, there's tens of millions of them who believe that the election was stolen by Joe Biden. He knew that. He exploited it. That's why I think he might be held criminally responsible. I'm not confident because, again, he's a little snake. He likes to slither out of everything, and he'll probably croak from 4 or 5 years from now from, like, a heart attack or something anyway, because he's like a big blob. He's in such terrible shape. But if he doesn't croak in 4 or 5 years from that, hopefully he gets to go in prison. I have lots of problems with their justice system, but he's one guy that I genuinely wouldn't care if he got rehabilitated, because I don't think he can be.
No. Well, there's an evolving epistemology on the right, which is if liberals are angry about it, it must be true. And I think that's sort of the main reason why evangelicals or social conservatives, people that seem to share no values whatsoever with Donald Trump, were so willing to get on board with Donald Trump. A philanderer, someone who's paid prostitutes to piss on the guy. Why is an evangelical who believes in family values supporting this man? It's because every word he said pissed off the left, and as a right-wing guy, anything that owns the libs, quote unquote, is fact. That's the only epistemology that this group accepts anymore. And talking about conspiracy theories, and you're talking about abacus data, the polling showed that there is 5.6 million Canadian adults who believe that COVID vaccines have killed many people and it's been covered up. There are 3.4 million Canadians that believe that COVID vaccines include secret chips designed to monitor and control behavior. So they believe nutty things. And the reason why that they can't be dislodged of those things is because they see media like the CBC, like mainstream media, that they have decided is left-wing, constantly say, that's not true. It's not true that COVID vaccines kill people. It's not true that COVID vaccines have chips that monitor your behavior. But the more we say it, and because we're coded as left-wing, the more we say it, the more they're convinced it must be true. So there's just nothing that can be said. And Donald Trump knows this, and he knows it's a sort of population that he can basically say absolutely anything he wants. And Pierre Poilievre knows exactly the same thing. They say anything they want. And because the left hates them so much, and the left is so ready to disprove what they're saying, actually all the efforts that the left are producing to disprove that information is only going to further solidify public opinion on the opposite side of the spectrum. The more the left tries to disprove something, the more the right believes it.
And I can give you a number of examples in Canadian politics of this happening. I mean, so this is one that the left should be rightfully criticized for, in my opinion. There's huge understaffing right now at airports all across the country. Huge understaffing. And I understand that somewhere in this guy's office, somewhere in this minister's office, some staffer likely advised him to divert from focusing on the staffing issues that the Canada Border Services Agency is having. But when Minister Omar Al-Gabra, the transport minister, was asked what was causing these huge delays, and we're seeing huge delays all across the country at airports, huge lines, ridiculous. People asked him, reporters, like, what do you think, what's the issue here? Why is it taking so long for Canadian airports to get going again? Why are there these massive lines? And he goes, well, like people are getting used to traveling again, and everything adds on like extra time, you have to take out the shampoo bottle here, so that adds 10 seconds. Then you have to add the phone, that adds 15 seconds. And it's like, honey.
Idiocy.
Honey.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like
buddy, like, please, no. When your government is having problems, and the first thing you do is blame the public.
It's the voters' fault. Yeah.
Liberal or conservative. This doesn't just apply to the left, but this is a critique of something a left-wing politician said. You don't ever blame the public for structural issues that your government is having. So of course he got set upon by the right, and he should have, to be honest. I mean, not the horrible. He's faced a lot of horrible racist things, and I'm not saying he should face that, obviously. I'm just saying the legitimate critiques of what he said about how ridiculous it was, he deserves that, because it is ridiculous. That's not going to track to anybody outside of a PMO meeting. That's ridiculous. So, and they're so out of touch from reality that they're exposing their flanks. They're really, really exposing their flanks badly to the right. And it is true that the source of this understaffing is just affecting things government-wide. It's affecting my department, your department, everybody's department. Almost everybody's department in government right now is having staffing issues because of pandemic-related delays. Then just say that. Just say, we're so sorry. Like, we know everybody's frustrated. You know what they could have easily done? Easily, because they like to spend money, this government. They could have said, we realize you guys are having delays. Like, we're so sorry that this is happening. We're just having some staffing issues getting staffed up. It should be another, however long it's going to be, or you can just, you don't even have to say the exact, just, it'll only be another couple of weeks or whatever. But in the meantime, like, while we're working through this, we'd like to waive landing fees or something, or then not only are you admitting that there's a problem and you're showing contrition, but you're giving the public a little goodie. Like, okay, we'll waive landing fees until this ends so that you have a little bit of a discount on your ticket, because we know that you're going through a lot of crap. And like, everybody's flipping out at the airlines, but the airlines are like, no, you're gonna, like, for once it's not us, it's CBSA. So that's one real example from Canadian politics, and I could give more, but I don't want to talk too much, so I'll kick it back to you. But I mean, that's another thing that's just going to totally feed conspiracy theories about why the delays are happening, and it's just a disaster.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to continue on my point about that the right wing is building sort of a new alternative universe of facts. And I think that there's actually a Canadian is playing a really important role in that, and that's Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
And, Jordan Peterson, he's become famous worldwide. By some accounts, he is now Canada's foremost public intellectual. And I don't mean to say that Jordan Peterson is the smartest man in Canada. I mean that Jordan Peterson is the most well-known intellectual from Canada now. That's undisputed. He's the best-selling author that we've had in decades, sadly. And, when I listen to Jordan Peterson, although he's trained as a psychologist and theoretically should know nothing about philosophy, he actually does a pretty good introductory course on Western philosophy, but only up to the 1960s. And basically everything that we've learned since then, he's either ignorant of or he willfully ignores.
Dismisses.
Yeah. And so here's the problem. In 1960, this is what we knew about the Indigenous genocide. Nothing. In 1960, it was commonly accepted that the Americas was basically empty when Europeans arrived, and that Europeans took over the continent pretty well peacefully. They fought some battles here and there, but the population estimate, the pre-Columbian population estimate in 1960 was in the hundreds of thousands. And then in 1976, it was geographer William Denevan who first postulated that actually this population was like 50 million. And at least 90% of them died within the first century of contact with Europeans. Now, demographers today say that it could have been as high as 112 million. And like 95% of these people, our ancestors killed off. But again, in 1960, we didn't know that. And, Frantz Fanon, we had this whole idea of post-colonialism, of European and Western countries need to grapple with the terrible things they did in colonialism, the terrible things they did to Indigenous people, and rectify it. When Jordan Peterson is teaching everyone about philosophy and stops at the 1960s, what he's really doing is reversing everything that we have learned in that post-colonial history. And he's starting to quite. It's revisionism. He's trying to bring us back to a world where we didn't have queer theory, we didn't have gender theory, we didn't have post-colonial ideas. We basically have no factual basis to make any sort of claims of oppression along class or gender or Indigenous history. That is essentially what's being chipped away at right now. The idea that BIPOC people or the idea that queer people could share some sort of common identity is being removed so that those people are easier to control. That's the ultimate objective of this. And now we're seeing, at the same time when we're talking about January 6th, a very similar discourse is also appearing on the American side, where we're seeing Republican candidates are bringing up the idea that America isn't really a democracy. If you look at the text of the Constitution is very clear that America is a republic, not a democracy. And this is true because the American founders were afraid of democracy. They did not really like the idea of one man, one vote, because they were all really rich guys and they were all afraid that if all the poor people got together, they'd just steal their stuff. So they built a lot of checks and balances into the system to frustrate democracy. It was a very deliberate attempt. American right-wingers are going back to this old history. They're looking this up and they're like, democracy is not very important. It's all about these constitutional checks and balances. It's all about building a republican form of law and order. And they're basically creating a fascist ideology that can be easily exported elsewhere. And this is why we as Canadians need to be afraid of this, is that our intellectuals like Jordan Peterson are contributing to this. And it just makes it so much easier for these ideas to be exported across the border. They're building this whole alternative universe of philosophies and facts to justify a system of logic that explains these ideas. It's not that these people are irrational. They're not irrational. They use different systems of rationality than we are using. And that's what makes them dangerous. It's not that they're crazy. They're not in any way, shape, or form crazy. They're quite logical. They're just working on a complete different world of facts.
Yeah, and it's selective to their biases, as is our system of logic.
We are.
Everybody's got biases, and everybody, whether they like it or not, is going to be subconsciously or consciously influenced by their biases. That's just the way it goes. But I think social media has sped up the creation of these sort of alternative fact universes. It's sped up this revisionism that we're seeing. It's, we're slowly seeing stuff creep out across the U.S. about restricting abortion access, about not talking about race in schools. We're going to pretend that none of this happened because it's convenient for us, and pretending like it didn't happen is easier than the damage that admitting it did happen will do to our narrative. And it's, it's the same with the Duda government in Poland. I believe it was Duda who brought in that legislation to criminally punish anybody who suggests Poland had a complicit role in the Holocaust, which sadly I think members of the state did at the time. I mean, they didn't have much choice. They were...
Oh, it's more than that, Liam. There are right-wing elements in Poland and in Ukraine that helped the fascists go to power and found Jews and rounded them up.
But you can't say that without getting criminally punished. So it's like we're seeing not only like sort of these right-wing populists refute things that happened in the past, atrocities that happened in the past, anything in which white people might not look the best. We're seeing it become almost criminal or taboo to challenge that. You were talking about already the denialists are coming out of the woodwork about residential schools. And I remember John Kay and Barbara Kay, a couple of fascists that somehow have a platform to write with the National Post, keep repeating
our biggest
that
news chain.
There were no bodies. There were no bodies found. There were no bodies found. It's like, yeah, because they haven't had time to excavate them. And then they're like disputing the science behind like the hits. So basically they had this ground scanning machine that can detect for probable bodies. And they got, however many 100 hits. And they're, what if the hits were something else and blah, blah, blah. And like, it's just all this denialism. Like, not a single body has been found. There were no mass graves. It's like, of course there were no mass graves, but there are a number of unmarked graves. More and more bands are finding these unmarked graves on their territory. And there are bodies that are under there. The science is very clear on the kind of ground scanning technology that they're using. It's not as if this is some kind of dubious pseudoscience, like it's some sort of like newfangled like metal detector and it just gets tripped up by every odd thing. It's like this is proper ground scanning gear. A lot of bands are still trying to get the funding from the federal government and their respective provincial governments on being able to afford or get access to this equipment so they can find their own graves. And all of this is established fact, but we do have Canadian sources that are sowing doubt. Terry Glavin, the National Post columnist that Jesse Brown from Canada Land interviewed the other week, he wrote a column that was quite shoddily done. A lot of what he chose to fixate on was like, okay, why are you even fixating on this then? If you believe that this residential school system was a horrible atrocity, was a horrible act of genocide, why are you fixating on the fact that there was an error a year ago in reporting?
And then that got picked up on and that got circulating through the right-wing community, and now it's a proof point for why there was no genocide to begin with. Exactly. And then he was called onto Canada Land, and I mean I do think that Jesse Brown did edit the conversation a bit, but I'm a journalist by trade, for listeners that don't know. I went to school for journalism, that's my degree. There's an old school of thought with journalism. You get a lot of these old guys, usually older white guys, that have been doing it for 40, 50, 60 years. And their thing about journalism is we have to report the truth. Our utmost duty is to the truth. And that is a conviction that is shared by today's class of journalists, but the way it manifests itself is different. So Terry Glavin's generation of journalists, they say, we have to report the truth. And his example of doing that would be to write a story on how initially the residential school story was reported as mass graves when it was in fact unmarked graves. And he's going to write a whole article about it, about how that happened a year ago and nobody really corrected it. And there was this mass hysteria for what he is implying to be no reason. And that when Jesse Brown challenged him on the Canada Land interview, why are you fixating on that? Like, I understand it was an error. Like, we should be calling out errors in reporting. That was an error. I'll grant you that. Why was your story fixating on this so-called hysteria? Well, we have to report the truth, and the truth was that, it wasn't mass graves, it was unmarked graves. Okay, fine. But then, he kept digging about, well, what is this hysteria? Well, everybody was all hysterical about, like, all of these, and, like, my God, I can't believe how torn up everybody was. People should have known for 40 years that these sites existed. Like, that was always the truth, and that's what I reported, and blah, blah, blah. But do you see where you're kind of losing his argument? Like, the fact is that whether we like it or not, the general public has had their head in the sands for Canada's existence. It's always about how much better we are than the States and about how multicultural we are and diverse we are, and we are. But said in such a way that, you really couldn't get much better than Canada, and then it makes us, like, ignore our problems. And so when this story came out, folks were shell-shocked.
because a lot of them had their heads in the sand, myself included. For years I had my head in the sand, and I grew up, hearing things from family and friends, negative things from family and friends about Indigenous people, and that was just what people thought, and I never really kind of understood why until I was older and able to get a little more education about it myself. And so I think a lot of Canadians who were once casually racist about this, some will continue to be, and some are shell-shocked. Absolutely shell-shocked. I think for a small subset of those people, I'd like to hope that was the issue that changed their lives and their view on this. So that's the story. You want to know what the story is? That's the story. We found unmarked graves in our country. We're a G7 country. We like to think of ourselves as a progressive country. We found unmarked graves all over our country of dead children. All over our country who were taken from their homes, who were not given a choice on whether or not to attend these schools, who often studied in dire situations with abuse, with inadequate food, with inadequate housing, with inadequate resources, and they died at these schools, and they never saw their families. They died. So it's like, that's the story, Terry. So like, that's the difference between somebody who started journalism 50 years ago, some of the reporters who started journalism 50, 60 years ago and haven't evolved. They're simply saying, well, I have a duty to report the truth, and it is a fact that they're not mass graves, it is unmarked graves. And that's true, and I wouldn't have even had a problem with that if it was like a short little story, like, like curious, nobody really, like...
An editor's note.
Editor's note kind of thing. But to make a whole piece about how, you're implying, he didn't say it, but implying through the whole piece, and he knows what he's implying, that the hysteria was largely for naught, is just disingenuous, and it misses the point. And that's why I think when he was asked about it, and why he sort of framed it as this crazy hysteria in his National Post story, that's why he got so cagey and defensive, because he didn't want to admit that he'd done anything wrong. Because he's an old, grizzled journalist, and that's always the way he's done it. And the reality is, whether he likes it or not, I know he's spent a lot of time embedded in various First Nations over his career, and he does have a deep working knowledge of a lot of the bands, more than I know. The reality is, even though he knows a lot about it, he still covers it through the lens of a white cis man. That's just how it is. And I think the difference between him and journalists who are younger, they put a little more emphasis on making sure that the stories are balanced. Mm-hmm. If you're going to write a piece about the mass graves actually being unmarked graves, have a story with Indigenous voices. Maybe they say, yeah, it's a bit weird it was reported as mass graves, but God, it's terrible. And like refocus the story on the actual issue here, which is the fact that bands, as of this moment, are digging up their children's skeletons. That's the story, whether you like it or not. And so the unfortunate part is, although I don't think Glavin meant entirely to like be a denialist, his reckless framing of the narrative through his fixating on what he thought was hysteria or undeserved hysteria is reinforcing the narrative from the right-wing people in Canada that we freaked out for nothing. It was all, why is everybody freaking out? We haven't even dug up the bodies yet. There hasn't been a body found. Like, as if that changes a single tangible thing. But it's being blasted all over Twitter. I've seen it all over Twitter. I've seen it from Mr. Dog Shampoo user John K. I've seen it from his mother Barbara, who is somehow still alive and maybe just surviving on hate at this point. I don't understand why these people don't understand what they're doing. And, Jesse Brown, I usually like his reporting. I do think sometimes he can, in his own right, be a little bit curmudgeonly. But I do think he got this one right in asking Terry Glavin, why did you do this? Don't you see how you fixating on this part of the story is sometimes even though a story is the truth, like technically the truth, there's more harm in fixating on that than adding it in as a sub note. It's not that you don't have to touch on it. It's not that he didn't have to say, oh, they got this wrong. It's the fact that he decided to make it as a focus and then didn't see how harmful that was going to be, especially due to the fact that he didn't include any Indigenous voices. It was just him lamenting the fact about how sad Canada has gotten over this, event, as if we shouldn't be sad about it. It was just very bizarre. And we're seeing things range from the bizarre to, from white columnists like Terry Glavin, who don't completely realize what they're doing or what's wrong, to willingly misleading people And a lighter example that I would compare it to is Bill 21 in Quebec. If anybody challenges Bill 21 in Quebec, they become persona non grata. It is not only like politically damaging to criticize Bill 21, it is considered hearsay because it is so popular among the populace, and the premier knows that. And that's why we keep saying populism. It's like, well, what does populism mean? Populism, right wing or left wing, appeals to popular attitudes, and popular attitudes can include biases that some people don't even realize they have until the policy is proposed. So, for example, I guarantee you that 80% of Quebecers don't consider themselves racist. There's always more people that are actually racist than admit they're racist, but some 80% of Quebecers support Bill 21. And that is a blatantly racist law. And it's not that populism is inherently bad and can't be used to achieve honorable goals. It's the way in which it's being used by the right, as we've talked before on this podcast, without a substantive response from the left. If Justin Trudeau is going to keep going, oh, no, it's just the travelers at the airport slowing things down, or, oh, no, we don't actually have that much of a role in inflation. And even though that's true, that's not good enough. It's not good enough. You need a response. And not only a messaging response, you need a policy response. You need to be seen to be doing something about these issues that are being raised. Because if you are not, it is extremely easy for somebody like Pierre Poilievre to hammer in on the issue of inflation effectively, very effectively. And as of right now, I've not seen, I mean, I'm sure they're working on it. Hopefully they're not going to take too long, but I haven't seen a coherent response from the government to people like Poilievre who, on their way to power, are fomenting conspiracy theories and stoking that rhetoric to get to power. Do you really think for a second that he actually cares about any of those individual people? I don't think he does. I do genuinely believe that he believes in a lot of what he's saying. I'm not saying he's not principled, but that's what makes him all the more dangerous, that he believes what he's saying. So
there's a fantastic piece of evidence for this that I would just like to point out, and that's in the French parliamentary election. So, like, in the French presidential election, it ended up being between Macron's centrist candidate and Marine Le Pen, far right-wing candidate. And the far-right candidate got crushed because the war in Ukraine to French voters was one of the number one issues. And of course, Le Pen, who's borrowed millions of dollars for her party from Russian banks, was way worse on that topic than Macron. 2 months later, not even 2 months later in the parliamentary elections, the war in Ukraine isn't in the top 10 issues for French voters, and inflation is. And now Macron's majority in the parliament is under threat, and National Rally is running third place, only a few percentage points behind his party. And for the first time ever, they're projected to get a huge number of seats in their parliament and loads and loads of public funding associated with winning those seats. So this is like in a couple of months. That's how fast the turnaround was, basically, between a huge victory for Macron. He's riding on top of the waves, and then he does nothing to the major issue of the day, and now his power is very much in threat, and the far right is on the rise.
Yeah, and I'm not saying like just fix the housing bubble, you guys. Just fix inflation.
Yeah,
I mean, I am about the housing bubble. I'm not about inflation because
you should have fixed it 20 years ago.
Seriously, now it's like it's too broke to fix. Like, I mean, we obviously need non-market housing because treating housing as an asset class under our system obviously isn't a very equitable way to do that. And inflation, it is true that governments have some control, but not a lot of control. A lot of people think they have a lot more control than they do with inflation, with gas prices, with all kinds of stuff. And opposition politicians know that, and they've exploited it for years on both sides of the aisle. I'm not going to say that left-wingers have never exploited that either. But the reality is you need to be seen to be responding to these things, because Poilievre, whether we like it or not, we don't have to like him, is very good at getting his message across to the people he knows will receive it. And he's very good at taking his kind of sort of spunky, kind of sassy tone and importing that into a retail politics sort of format where he's making these videos. You saw these videos of him at Pearson Airport, walking the long line of people at Pearson saying, look, isn't this terrible? We're going to end the mandates, blah, blah, blah. And then the government, at least from a political comm standpoint, they popped this balloon. They did pop this balloon because he made that video. It got very popular. People were like, why isn't the government doing something about this? And what would you have it? They've ended all the mandates for travel. I'm not saying that the solution is to bow down to what Poilievre or whoever the conservative politician is asking for.
We just got to do something.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and when it comes to doing something, I think there is, again, in that French example, there is something that we progressives need to look at. Because one of the major reasons why the far right hasn't completely swamped the elections is because there's a new force that just appeared on the French political scene. It's a popular front of all the left-wing and green parties together called the New Populist Union. It's really hard to translate. It's the New Socialist and Ecological Popular Union, essentially. And this comes from something that began in the Spanish Civil War last century, when leftists of all stripes had to band together to fight against fascism in Europe. And they temporarily ignored their differences and realized that fascists were a far greater problem than any one of their individual left-wing causes, and they had to join together in a popular front to overturn them. Now, the NUPS, as it's called, this union of popular forces, they're actually running second. They're more popular than the National Rally, whereas when they were all separate Green parties and Socialist parties, they barely got any representation in Parliament whatsoever. It was just Macron's centrist party that had a supermajority they used to do nothing but roll back regulations and cut workers' pensions, essentially. Like, it's a joke what Macron's government was doing. Now, left-wing forces, because they join together, they can put real pressure on the government to solve people's problems, to prevent them from joining to the fascist cause because their lives keep getting worse. This is something we need to start doing. Leftists have solutions. We progressives know how to make people's lives better so that they're not going to be as easily alienated from society and as easily co-opted by these conspiracy theory groups, by these right-wing demi-fascists. But we're only going to be able to do that if we get into power, if we get into a position where we can actually make people's lives better. And the more we split the vote amongst each other, the more that we constantly fight, the more that we nitpick at one another, the more people like Pierre Poilievre have an opportunity to come up the middle. And I listen to conservative and liberal campaigners and staffers all laughing at the idea of there being a unity on the left. Well, fuck them. They're going to be the ones that are going to end up destroying our country. If we cannot get our shit together as progressives and join the same freaking team, we're going to lose this country. Period.
The reality is that poor people in this country need help now. They need help right now. Here is just a little bit of an illustration of how dire things have gotten. In case you haven't been able to wake up and smell the feces-scented coffee here on Speech from the Throne, in my city of Halifax, the city council just approved a plan to allow camping, tent camping, in 4 public parks because there's not enough housing, not enough safe housing in the city of 500,000 people for all of the homeless to stay. The saddest part is 4 sites in the city is probably about the bare minimum they could have done and will only house about 30 people per site. There are some 500, 600 people without housing living in Halifax. And there's a group in here in Halifax called Halifax Mutual Aid. They're anonymous. They don't really it's a bunch of volunteers. Nobody really knows who's part of it. And they do that on purpose to avoid scrutiny. And they build these small shelters with Tyvek and wood. And it's not the most ideal construction, but it's better than a tent. And they've built a lot of these shelters in various parts, and HRM, the Halifax Regional Municipality, that's the city, has been fighting them at every turn about it, and because they're approaching it with this classic centrist kind of like, well, we should help some people, but can we really help everyone? They haven't said that, but that's just kind of the vibe that I get. And they've been dragged kicking and screaming by more progressive counselors and progressive entities in the city to slowly start doing something. So they've set up a number of mobile homes on the Dartmouth side for people to stay in. They're now allowing tent camping at some of these parks. But, you know, there's still this provision that kind of police have to get involved at certain turns, you know, and the reality is that poverty criminalizes you. If you don't have a house and you have nowhere to stay and somebody's built this nice shelter for you, you're obviously going to stay in the nice shelter. You're not going to sleep on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
And then you're getting criminalized when the police show up and tell you to leave because you're not technically supposed to be there. Even though, what's the point of having a public park when it's not open to all members of the public? I've always found that quite bizarre. It's almost like this bizarre centrist, like neoliberal pearl clutching. Oh my God, these poorly clad rugrats are staying near my house,
Yeah.
and like,
What about my property values?
What about my property values? Like, obviously, like some of these people, there's been times where some of these people have been in distress. Like there's been a handful of incidents, I guess, where that did have to get reported to police. But of course, as usual with the homeless, that is getting inflated as, well, what if the cops have to get involved because they're homeless and they're going to do crazy stuff? Like people assume that they're going to do a bunch of crazy stuff because they're homeless, instead of dealing with the mental illness on a case-by-case basis. And Mike Savage, the mayor, who, by the way, was a Liberal MP for many years, a Liberal, embarrassed himself when he was forced to defend the Halifax police response, or I shouldn't even say forced to defend. He made a choice to defend the Halifax police response last summer when a number of these shelters were dismantled in the city's downtown core, who used pepper spray on, among other people, a child, and decided it was a good idea to run into the crowd of solidarity protesters and residents staying in those shelters with batons and the whole bit. It was all caught on camera. It was a complete embarrassment for the city. And when he was asked about, like, well, like, you know, some of these people should be staying in shelters, and it's like, yeah, sure. But a lot of them fear the shelters because not only is COVID rampant through them, there's sexual assault issues, there are sexual harassment issues, particularly if you're a woman, particularly if you're trans, you aren't always welcomed. So they don't want to be in these shelters because the city hasn't put enough effort into making them a welcoming place for everybody. And if you're not going to put the effort, if it's always going to be an afterthought, that's why you then respond to a homelessness crisis with, well, I guess we can grant these 4 parks for you to use, as if it's going to even make a dent. And I guess we'll set up these like 7 or 8 mobile homes. And like, I'm not saying they shouldn't be doing that at all. It's great that they're doing it. But what I'm saying is that it's like the municipality has been dragged and dragged and dragged by progressive voices to only do the bare minimum. Just the bare minimum. And I see these shelters all the time, you know. I drive by, there's one at Meagher Park in the West End, and it's fine, you know. Like there's a bunch of people like kind of meandering about, and they're going on their business. Like it's not like they're really particularly bothering anyone. If someone does get bothered, the cops get called, and you know, and then it can get ugly. But there's calls that are few and far between about that. Like there really haven't been many very calls about that at all. It's been fine. It's the idea of homeless people staying at these parks that some people don't like, and they won't just come out and say it. And the trouble is that we keep electing these safe kind of centrist politicians because they don't freak us out as much, when we should be electing more left-wing politicians because they're the ones that will have the guts to make the systemic changes needed. Like, you know, like maybe it's time to have a discussion about ending housing as an asset class. It's obviously not going to save what's already happened. But my God, like, are we just going to sit here and let this continue? It's like everybody throws their hands up and just lets right-wing grifters come in for the feeding and convert the populace to fascism. You know, I think I've made my point, but like, I would just say, like, listeners, look around in your municipality. What's the situation like there with the opioid crisis? Are there dozens of people that are in need of addiction services and support that are just instead on your street overdosing? What about the homelessness crisis? Are there people who are unhoused who are camping out in your city parks? Are there temporary shelters being built because they have nowhere else to go? Is nothing being done? Take a look. I know it's easy to get locked in with the blinders and go about your day to day. There's a lot of shitty news happening, and I know it's a lot to take in, but take a second one day, drive through your town or city or village or wherever you are, and see how the municipality is dealing with those issues, because I guarantee you that a good chunk of them aren't dealing with it effectively, and oftentimes don't have any support from their provincial or federal counterparts.
No. Like, I know that our listeners and those pearl clutchers that you are mentioning are really afraid of terrorism. So I'd just like to take a minute and say, like, do you know what made the Taliban so successful and why they were able to take over Afghanistan? It's not because their message was popular. A lot of the things that they say are not supported by anything in Islam, and there's no Muslim that would really have any interest in what the Taliban is selling. What the Taliban did have was food, they had shelter, they had well-paying jobs that they could give their supporters, and so when their economy collapsed, they were able to recruit people that were so desperate that they were forced to turn to them. And that's why the Taliban is now in control of Afghanistan, a country that used to be very modern, that used to be very progressive in the 1970s. It was a beautiful place, and now it's taken over by a bunch of religious extremists, not because their message was popular, but because the people were so poor they had no opportunity but to seek refuge with them. That is a real problem that can happen here. We have our own versions of the Taliban right here in Canada. The KKK is offering opioid services and addictions counseling to people in the southern United States. They have seen where the governments are failing, and they are filling in the gap. And I'm not aware of right-wing organizations that are doing this in Canada, but if they're not doing it now, I'm sure that they will be doing it in the future. It's something that our governments are really deficient, and especially when we're in the middle of an inflation crisis where we know there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be very desperate, and we see that there are right-wing causes that can raise money in a flash, as we saw in the Freedom Convoy, there's certainly going to be some anti-poverty infrastructure that's going to be built into these fascist organizations. And this is how they're going to be recruiting people. Poverty is a political disaster, and we need to start fixing it. Otherwise, we're just increasing the base of people who are going to be potentially swayed by these ideas.
Well, and here's another. I think I'll make this my last point, just to hammer everything home here. One way in which the right has kind of entangled themselves in issues primarily affecting lower income demographics is abortion. So in Canada, a lot of you fellas and gals listening might be familiar with what is termed ridiculously crisis pregnancy centers. Now, these centers they're framed in such a way that they're set up to counsel women when they're debating having an abortion. What they do, even though they won't even they'll go to such lengths as to not even admit it in an interview situation that this is what they do, but what they often do is try to talk the woman out of having an abortion. And that's not really for them to decide. That's up to the woman. And the woman is going there thinking they're getting like neutral emotional support, but then they start talking about like not getting an abortion, and like sometimes we'll even talk about God, and we'll give them pamphlets about why they shouldn't have an abortion, and about, how it's actually not that hard to raise a child. And like basically like when the right lost the abortion debate in 1987, it immediately pivoted to opening these crisis pregnancy centers, which many of them operate to this day without any disruption. And people don't realize as well that abortion access in Canada is very bad, particularly because of how large we are landmass wise. Like we have a large landmass as a country. So think if you live in Tees, Alberta, and you have to go to Red Deer, I would think would be like the closest place that you could get an abortion. But maybe you're raised in a somewhat Christian fundamentalist household, and you're told to go to this pregnancy center, and they're going to help. They're going to counsel you. You're going to figure it out. They're going to counsel you. So you're like, all right, at least I'm getting some counseling. And then they pump you full of all this stuff. And then you don't get an abortion when maybe you would have chosen to get an abortion. And I'm not saying like, you should always get an abortion. I'm saying it's a choice, and it's a choice that should be left up to the woman to make. She shouldn't be coerced in any direction or another, and that's what these pregnancy centers are set up for, so-called pregnancy centers, because they're not there to support women in crisis. They're there to push their agenda. There's an agenda. whether we like it or not, and they're flying under the radar in Canada right now. I haven't seen the federal government, for all their talk about abortion, for all they're using it as an electoral wedge against the Tories, for all of that, I haven't seen them do a damned thing about crisis pregnancy centers. They could easily do something. They haven't done a damn thing. So it continues to flourish.
Yeah, if we don't act, the other side will. That's the lesson of politics. And so every lazy day in government is a day not just wasted, it's a day the other side wins. We can't stand any longer a government that isn't absolutely seized with action. And that isn't this federal government.
Our house is on fire and we have to put it out. And
Absolutely.
If we don't put it out, then somebody from the right is going to pour gasoline on it and the whole country will go up in flames. And I know that sounds dramatic. I don't think even Jacob was saying that we'll turn into a Taliban-controlled nation tomorrow. But my God, you can sure let things go out of hand and people will get poorer if we continue to treat housing the same way. People will get poorer if we continue to treat employment the same way. People will get poorer if we do not make the systemic changes required to guarantee that Canada stays a prosperous nation.
Yep.
And it becomes even more prosperous for those who can't buy into that because of how the system is structured. And on that happy note, thank you for listening. I hope this happy tale made you smile. I hope you have some hope for the future, because it's not all is lost. We can do something, but we just we have to do
As
something.
I said, in France, the left is mobilizing and they're finally winning. Yep. There's a possibility for victory here, but we got to mobilize.
There is, and it's like Yoda said.
Do or do not. There is no try.
Do or do not. And anyway, if you have anything to say about this week's episode, you can share your thoughts with us at speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. That's speechfromthethrone, all one word, lowercase, @gmail.com. We always love hearing what you have to say. And hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll see you again in 7 days' time.
Bye.